I'm thrilled to be back at the Business Insurance Virtual Cannabis and Hemp Conference. My name is Dr. Paloma Layfeld. I'm the Senior Director of Clinical Science at Goodness Growth Holdings, formerly known as Vireo Health. We are the only physician-led and physician-founded cannabis company in the United States. I also serve as the Vice Chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee at NCIA. We're here today with an amazing panel for incredibly timely and important discussion about ensuring risk through understanding cannabinoid science and medicine. Cannabis is a plant that we as a human species have co-evolved with for thousands of years. Its first documented medical use was in 2800 BC, and cannabis was a huge integral part of physicians' toolkits in the United States from the 1850s until 1937, when the so-called war on drug began, which completely prohibited and criminalized cannabis in the United States. It currently sits as a Schedule I substance according to the Controlled Substance Act, making research virtually impossible and the stigma high. Today, the idea is really to incorporate a discussion on medical causation and litigated matters. We're seeing a huge uptick in injury and disease claims. So it's important that we discuss these issues today. We have an amazing panel. We have a physician, we have lawyers, and true experts in the field. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. First up, we have Ian Stewart. Ian is founder and co-chair of the Cannabis and Hemp Law Practice at Wilson Elser, where he leads a national multidisciplinary team of lawyers who serve all aspects of the cannabis and hemp industries, as well as financial institutions and insurance companies that service those industries. Ian additionally participates on the Policy Council of the National Cannabis Industry Association, and he is a member of the advisory board of the International Cannabis Bar Association. He has been named to the prestigious Chambers USA 2020 and 2021 Guide in Cannabis Law. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Paloma. Great to be here.
Great to see you. And next up, we have Andrew M. Rosner, who co-founded Hersana LLC with a group of physicians and researchers dedicated to advancing the public health and evidence-based benefits of cannabis medicine. Andrew leads his team in developing legally compliant medical marijuana programs for healthcare systems. He draws from his experience as a healthcare attorney and leadership positions he held in state and federal public health programs. Andrew works with government representatives on creating a safe and transparent cannabis industry. Welcome, Andrew. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you, Paloma. It's great to be here.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Stephen Dahmer, who's a board-certified family doctor whose passion for health and healing has taken him around the globe. A fellow of the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine for over a decade, he has studied the relationships between plants and people and has served as the chief medical officer at Goodness Growth Holdings since 2015, a physician-led medical cannabis company. He leads medical research partnerships, which are really helping to inform the development of new pharmaceutical-grade products with evidence-based outcome for patients. Additionally, he is the assistant clinical professor of family medicine and community health at the Icahn School of Medicine and Practice Clinical Medicine in Westchester. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Dahmer. How are you?
Doing great. Such a pleasure to be here and so excited. I mean, what a timely and important topic. So excited to get started.
Absolutely. And at the end of the panel, we will provide ways that you can contact each of the panelists. But before that, let's jump into it. First question for Ian Stewart around, do you think this developing understanding of cannabinoids is helpful or harmful to cannabis companies from a legal risk and insurance perspective? And then following that, are we seeing any impact yet in the courts?
Sure. So that's the million-dollar question that I think the industry has been grappling with for a few years. I think what we've really done a good job, we being the cannabis industry, we've focused a lot on licensing and on regulations and compliance that involve, licensing types and business structures and means of distributing products and even testing for, pesticides and contaminants and so forth. But I think where the stool may need to be leveled a bit is on the underlying science and the medicine around cannabinoids. And certainly the underwriters and the brokers and the risk managers that may be listening in, this is sort of the deficit in our understanding, I think. And the for the lawyers, I think the question is, cannabinoid science and the products are being, developed contemporaneously, which is really a unique thing in the history of sort of consumer products, right? I mean, we've had other classes of products where we've understood, retroactively or years later that something was harmful, but, not really what we're doing, with cannabis. And just because of the unique way it's developed with Schedule I, that's just, how it's happened. But, what's unreasonably dangerous in terms of product liability remains really an open question. There's few cases that have tested that in court. There's few kind of prospective long and short-term studies, and certainly the others on the panel can speak better to that. But what I've seen over the last few years is this sort of gradual, movement where if you're the plaintiff's bar and you're looking and you're saying, okay, when are we going to do that big, potential, and maybe it won't happen, but the big tobacco style sort of unseen toxic tort or environmental case that's going to really shake up the industry, which is, possible. Let's not kid ourselves. There's things like, the American Heart Association statement that came out last year, which looked in part at cardiovascular risks. And I think the good news is it's really still unclear. There's a lot of confounding things. I mean, I don't think there's anybody's tied a direct causative link or anything, but, there's some statements in there that I think we should all, the lawyers, the underwriters, the cannabis industry, we shouldn't put our head in the sand, and we should say, look, let's see what's out there, because we need to know, we need to be informed. The other, I think, issue that lawyers are going to be looking at is our edibles and the edible extraction processes. And, if that's a different sort of risk profile than other areas, other products, other routes of ingestion. And, we all know about the delayed, effect and so forth with edibles. But, there's a study from 2019. I'm just reading here. This is a study of almost 10,000 ER visits. And the conclusion was that the proportion of cannabis attributable visits with edible exposures versus smoking cannabis was 33 times higher than expected if both routes were equally toxic. If I'm a plaintiff's lawyer, I'm thinking to myself, that sounds pretty good if I'm going to hire an expert and get on the stand, right? Vapegate, right? August to November of 2019. Fortunately, that was really illicit market stuff, and nothing really came out of it. There's no lawsuits or anything. That was great. We dodged a bullet, but it was an eye opener for the industry. And now we got Delta 8 and Delta 10, and there's other things that are going to be coming down the road, and we got to be ready for it. And it's folks like Dr. Dahmer and Andrew here that are going to help us do it.
Yes, the need for regulation is of the utmost importance. We certainly all agree on that. You mentioned ER visits, and speaking of healthcare systems, Andrew, in your work with healthcare systems and practices, what types of concerns do you hear from practitioners, people on the ground in healthcare about prescribing cannabis medicines?
That's a great question. I think it's helpful to actually give a bit of context to those concerns. So when we look at a snapshot today of the cannabis landscape across the United States, we see a range of programs within states. We see medical cannabis programs, some that allow higher levels of THC, some that allow lower levels of THC. We see recreational, also called adult use here in New York, programs. Some states have them that have medical programs. Some states that have medical programs do not. We see hemp programs. Some are run by the federal government. Some are run by the states, as long as they meet the federal requirements. And we see combinations of those programs existing, and in some states not existing at all. So it's almost a verdant cannabis alphabet soup, in a sense, that exists within the United States at the moment. We need people like Ian to kind of make sense of it for all of us legally. But for physicians, it's a very challenging situation. And I think when we actually step back and ask, how is it that we got here? We know that the federal government stepped back and allowed for the states to experiment, in a sense, with cannabis. And really, the first programs that were created in the United States were medical programs, and then the other programs that I mentioned followed. So, when you think about how those medical programs were created, it wasn't through the classical routes of clinical trials, FDA approvals, the tools that physicians use to understand therapeutics, pharmaceuticals. So it's very challenging. What happened instead was that you had really, I think, two forces that were at work. One was kind of a social justice movement that sort of answered the war on drugs and addressed the issues that arose from that war on drugs. But the other, which I'd like to talk more about here, is groups of patients who saw the benefits of cannabis medicines and advocated at the legislative level in their states, and also obviously at the executive level, and were able to help to inform decision makers who then created medical programs. And what happened from there is that physicians suddenly were in a situation where they had obviously the therapeutics that they understood, that they used in their practices on a regular basis, that had an evidence base. And then this new therapeutic, patients coming into their offices, talking about the benefits to their friends, to their family, to people that they didn't know. Of course, there was a whole set of media around cannabis. And I think one of the things that physicians were sort of thrown into were seeing that there were these benefits, but not necessarily having the tools. And I just anecdotally, I was once at a Yankees game with about 15 physicians, and I think starting in inning 3, they cornered me and basically for the rest of the game just asked me question after question about cannabis medicines. And really out of that, along with all of the work we're doing at Persona, we really see sort of 3 categories of concerns. One is around the medical issues related to cannabis, the other legal issues connected with cannabis, and the third are the economics of cannabis. So the clinical are really looking at how to prescribe, the safety profile of cannabis medicines, dosages for specific conditions, side effects, drug-to-drug interactions, methods of administration, and which ones to choose for specific conditions. On the legal side, we see concerns by the physicians for themselves and their practices, as well as for their patients. So they're looking at ensuring that they're prescribing in compliance with state programs. They want to make sure that when they do prescribe to, let's say, police officers or school bus drivers, things like that. I mean, we recommend not prescribing to school bus drivers generally, just for the record. But in any case, they have questions around prescribing for various types of employees. And then, of course, on the economic side, the value proposition of cannabis medicines for their practices, obviously for their patients first, but for their practices as well as for the healthcare system. So we really try to kind of bring all of those issues or address those issues in the work that we do, because those are ongoing questions.
The work that you do, Andrew, is so imperative. I think that the common theme here from hearing from Ian and Andrew is that the lack of research is really doing a disservice to those who are using cannabis. Because of the Schedule I status, it's virtually impossible to perform randomized control trials, which is the gold standard of research. But there are, companies like Persona and Vireo that are really doing their best to go around that, or for lack of a better term. Switching over to speak more about research to Dr. Dahmer, research is needed, as we're all agreeing on, in general, in medical cannabis. Can you speak about some of the work you're doing to establish a research base for medical cannabis?
Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe just to add on a little bit to keep the conversation going on some of the other topics. Being frontline and lecturing and engaging physicians for 6 years now to try to adopt or at least be open minded to cannabis, it's really amazed me as a physician myself. Everything is stacked against it, and yet we see some movement. And Andrew summed up everything fantastically. I mean, just a simple aspect of that, for years, physicians didn't know if my liability insurance would cover my work in the cannabis realm. And just right there is going to stop the majority of physicians in their track, not to mention.
They still don't.
Yeah, well, it's still a question. Some have gone directly to their liability insurance and asked that question. But yeah, it's still a huge question. But everything's been stacked against this, and yet there is movement. And so, one of the first things that we saw, as Paloma mentioned, a physician-led, physician-founded company, is what is the common language, right? That physicians, that patients, that pharmacists, that insurance, that politicians sometimes speak, and that is research, right? And so we planted the seeds very early in an incredibly difficult climate to do research specifically on products that are available in the market. So the majority of research is, and I would say, Ian, again, to your point, that there are estimates that near $1 billion has been spent studying the harms of this plant, right? And it's really very little money that's being spent on potential benefits and of products that are currently being used in the market. So we were very fortunate to partner with Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Montefiore Medical Center, that we are near wrapping up a $3.8 million NIH longitudinal study. And so our gold standard in medicine is a randomized control trial, and some doctors will speak down to longitudinal observational. In a complex medicine like cannabis, which is so tricky, I truly believe these longitudinal studies are going to give us some of our best evidence. And just to speak to that study a little bit, we're following hundreds of patients in the New York program, receiving what average patients would receive. There's no determination of what they must or must not have, and following the impact of that medical cannabis that they're consuming, and following very closely the dosing of that, because this is all data that's available, the impact of that on their chronic pain. Also, because it's not only a hot topic, but very important, as we're all aware, the impact of that on their opioid consumption. So these are all chronic pain patients currently utilizing opioids. In addition to that, just a slew of validated measures, from looking at depression, impact on depression, to anxiety, to sleep, to even potential for cannabis use disorder. This is going to be fantastic data that we planted that seed early to, again, create that platform by which we can create some of the things that we're discussing and have that, I guess we say, sort of data to say, hey, there is evidence here that it can potentially, and again, we're waiting for that data to come through, impact chronic pain, impact opioid use, and others. And then,
Stephen, sorry to interrupt. Can I ask one question? I think, and ask you to comment on it, because I've looked at a lot of these studies, and some of them have been cited in support cases, and it occurs to me that there are studies that are suggesting harms of cannabis that have selection bias, because they're only of hospitalized patients, for example, or only of patients with other, underlying conditions where, cannabis use is there, but it's sort of more of a, is it a correlation or a cause? And can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think that's really what's grabbing a lot of the headlines. And again, we hopefully might have time to speak to American Heart Association. There's a lot of headlines kind of grabbing at these, earlier epidemiologic studies that might have a correlation, but as you hinted to, Ian, not a causation. And it's difficult to discern that, especially in very complex medical patients. And that's the majority of the early adopters. If you look at a program like New York, these are some of our sickest patients. If we look at our memo trial, these are, patients that, suffer 6 to 10 comorbidities, oftentimes are cycling through a hospital. And, that's where these kind of alternative treatments oftentimes get their toe in the door, is treating those sickest and those hardest cases, where we will see some of these correlations. And, I think over time, we will suss out the potential for causation, and I'm never going to say that that doesn't exist. Every medicine has a shadow side and is a double-edged sword, and we need to know that as well as we know the benefits. And what I'm arguing is we've spent near $1 billion to know that shadow side. And I think the hard part is that the industry is evolving so quickly that when we say medical cannabis, this is a bit of a pet peeve for me. What the heck are we talking about? Because there are 1,000 different products on the market, as Paloma hinted at, with 1,000 different constituents. And so we really need to define, and I think that will be a job of the insurance company if and when medical cannabis is covered. What do we call medical? And that's what might be covered. And I hope we dig into that a little bit, because I do want to talk about edibles and oral delivery versus vaporized. But before I do, real quick, our research extended beyond that, and through private funding, we have launched a 4-arm randomized double-blind control trial where for the first time, patients, again, with chronic pain on opioids, we're looking at one of our products that has a higher THC component to it, still a whole plant base for that product, versus a 1-to-1 versus a higher CBD versus a placebo. So for the first time with products in the market, 4 arms directly evaluating those with a very closely titrated dosing schedule to see how that impacts their chronic pain, again, their opioid use, and again, a number of other validated measures from anxiety and depression to even cannabis use disorder.
Yeah, I think that, cannabis is such an atypical medicine plant that's used for medicinal purposes. As we talked about, we have synthetic constituents, delta 8, delta 10. We have, plant molecules. We have over 100 cannabinoids. So it's really a new category. And with that being said, switching it back to Ian a little bit, are there parallels? Have you seen parallels to other products that face a changing risk environment, and some lessons that cannabis companies may draw upon from those to adapt to changing risk?
Well, I hate to say that I'm old enough now to remember 20 years ago or so the litigation that arose against the earlier form of the dietary supplement industry. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with a little bit of the history, in 1994, Congress passed the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or the clunky name is DSHEA. And then after DSHEA, basically it switched the regulatory scheme for dietary supplements. So it's sort of like you go ahead and you market first and ask permission later, right? So you market it. You may send out a notice for a new dietary ingredient or something, but the FDA will say, okay, if we have a problem with it, we'll tell you. But it was actually the plaintiffs' lawyers that policed the industry, because what happened a few years after 94 was you got the Barry Bonds thing, and you got this sort of scrutiny on sports supplements, and what we saw was a slow wave at first, but then just a crush of litigation against these folks who were, playing loose with putting, questionable substances in dietary supplements, all the way up to, anabolic steroids, for example. And it took out, it literally wiped out a whole, portion of that industry through litigation. We saw that happen. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen to cannabis, but I think we should be aware of that history, because, history can repeat itself. And so, I think that it's hard to draw an analogy of, in terms of environmental risks or toxic tort exposures. You've got asbestos, and you've got tobacco, and you've got lead paint and talc, and, certain pharmaceuticals and household chemicals. I'm not saying cannabis is anywhere close to that, but what I'm saying is that the strategy that plaintiffs use or used against those industries can be employed in some ways against cannabis if the science aligns. And we have to have general causation, meaning you've got to have, if the allegation is hypothetically that someone suffered a stroke and there's a temporal relationship with a cannabis product, you got to have, the science supporting generally that can happen. And then you have to have specific causation, right? You got to, that particular plaintiff, you got to have, the conclusion medically that happened there. And right now we really don't have, I think it would be very difficult for a plaintiff's lawyer to establish either in most cases for most conditions. As a general statement. But, here, we've fortunately got the situation where the cannabis industry has the opportunity to get ahead of this. Nobody's actively concealing it like the tobacco industry. We're talking about it. We're being proactive, and that, I think, is half the game right there.
Paloma, I'd love to add something to that, just for 1 second. I wonder, Ian, too, your thoughts on, one parallel that comes to mind is certainly Deshay, but also caffeine. And, many might criticize me for comparing cannabis to caffeine, but I find many similarities in the concern for cardiovascular effects, certainly the concern for dependence. And one of the things that turned the tide, at least in my recollection, for caffeine was really showcasing the safety data and really having those mechanisms by which to monitor safety. And, again, one thing we instituted from day zero is a 24/7 pharmacovigilance program. And so now, having served over 100,000 unique individuals, we monitor that very closely and are on the brink of a publication. And, as a physician, to have dispensed to over 100,000 of some of the sickest patients and not a single death come through our pharmacovigilance, and that's not the only number. I'll certainly grant that, but certainly relatively satisfying in an epidemic of death. And we're going to be looking at that very closely. And to your earlier point, Ian, our number one hit are kind of the orally absorbed, and patients have to be very careful. It'll have that lower potential for abuse potential because it doesn't have the quick onset, but we have to be careful that we're not doubling doses because you're not feeling that right away. But that's soon to come, and I think we'll be really moving in the cannabis industry as well to really take a close look at that adverse event data.
Yeah, that's a great point. Safety is a huge barrier to healthcare providers because, we as healthcare providers are not taught about cannabis in medical school. So there's a huge hesitancy without that education for healthcare providers. So they don't know what they're really getting their patients into. So switching it back to Andrew, how do you begin to address this safety concern and some other concerns of the healthcare systems and physicians?
No, absolutely. No person's an island, and I think that's triply true for physicians. They rely on data in all of their decision making. They rely on a community of practitioners who have created a standard of care over time. I think when we're working with healthcare systems and physicians, one of the keys for us is generating as much data in our work as possible. So we actually have a whole division that collects clinical data, that collects economic data, and we actually feed that back to the healthcare system for their decision making. So, similar to what Stephen was saying, we really try to keep on top of everything that's happening connected with cannabis patients within the system. But even taking a step back from there, I think it's really crucial that physicians receive training on the front end. And I think some programs at the state level, some of the medical programs, they certify physicians to prescribe, but they don't necessarily provide the support to prescribe. And what I mean by that is there might be some requirements around, let's say, it might be a CME class, it might not be, but it's perhaps a class connected with cannabis medicines. But after that, they're on their own. And what ends up happening from our experience is often they will be prescribing. I think physicians, generally as a profession, they're incredibly capable and smart in the work that they do. Of course, you don't know what you don't know. And what ends up happening is sometimes patients, and patients will do this on their own as well, perhaps take too much of cannabis on the front end, have a negative experience, and drop out, meaning that they feel as though it's not for them. And so one of the things that we do, even before a physician prescribes cannabis, is we work with the group of physicians within the healthcare system in a pilot program. We conduct extensive trainings with the physicians, both from a clinical perspective as well as from a legal perspective. We look at every aspect. So from the physician to the ancillary services within the office to the back office. We look at every aspect of where cannabis is going to be prescribed, and we really want to almost create a model before it happens. We connect with their EMR. We collect the data from the physicians as the program's getting off the ground. We feed back that information to the physicians. We do a sort of version of grand rounds. It's not quite grand rounds, but we actually go in and we do case studies. So physicians will actually take cases and present them to the group of other physicians. And then we walk through, our clinical team walks through their thinking about those cases. And it's really all to mitigate risk and also to help the physicians feel supported. They're actually supported, and to learn about this new type of medication. And we do present studies. I mean, unfortunately, there's been a lack of research within the United States because of cannabis's status for so long, but there are international studies. So we do refer to some places where this has been ongoing. And then, of course, the great work that's now starting to happen on the ground here in the States, like the work Stephen's doing. So, we're really trying to stay at the cutting edge, and at the same time providing as much context and knowledge to the system and to the practitioners as possible.
Yeah, that knowledge is so imperative. You almost have to go back to medical school, which no one wants to do. And not only are you learning about 100 new cannabinoids and all the supporting molecules, but in some states there are thousands of SKUs available: soft gel, suppositories, flower, vapes, and it can be incredibly overwhelming, not to mention everyone's different endocannabinoid system and physiology. So there's a huge gray area, which is, incredibly dangerous. So education is really the barrier there. So
one thing I would just add actually is we also encourage physicians to contact registered organizations, the cannabis companies like Vireo directly, to ask questions. And the physicians that we've spoken to have actually had great experiences when they've reached out and communicated directly with the manufacturers of the products that they're prescribing. So we really do try to help the physicians connect the dots and realize that there are resources out there that they can use.
And Andrew, it seems to me, by the way, that maybe there's a reticence out there to do that. I mean, it seems like if it was any other pharmaceutical or something, there'd be no hesitance to just call up, Bayer or whatever, and say, hey, what's the intent here? I've got a question on the product insert or whatever it is. But maybe they don't want to call a cannabis company,
No, you're spot on, Ian, spot on. Definitely, it's been part of the challenge, is a lot of physicians are hesitant to prescribe. They're interested, and they ask, as I said, we went through many innings, literally, answering questions. I mean, there's a real interest. I think it's because they're hearing from their patients the benefits that their patients are experiencing. They realize that there's a potential for addressing some of the side effects of other pharmaceuticals by substituting cannabis medicines in the right way. I use the term broadly, but obviously, as Stephen pointed out, there is a science that's forming around how to use it. And so I think there's a real interest, but there's also, Paloma, you said it, that they didn't necessarily learn about it in medical school. There's a hesitancy, and I can speak, from being in New York, some of the physicians also have seen negative effects in the community. So they're really want to make sure when they start to prescribe that they're doing it right. And, some of that is coming out of experience, maybe some physicians directly with family members when they encountered the war on drugs. I mean, it was something that, some of the physicians we're working with are coming from all communities across New York City, and they just want to make sure that when they're doing, it's first do no harm. They want to make sure that they're doing it right from the start, and that's why I think it's really important to provide upfront services and information so that they can do it right.
Excellent. We applaud you for that work, and it's truly needed in all states. There are 36 states where medical cannabis is legal, and it is of the utmost necessity that education is provided to healthcare providers who really are the gatekeepers here. I do want to switch gears a little bit to insurance coverage and toss it back to Ian. How do insurance companies see future risk around cannabinoids, and what are they going to do to respond?
Well, I mean, insurance companies are about data, and the good news that we've got over the last few years is we've got much better data around claims types and loss ratios, and in terms of property coverage versus product liability risks, and where are the bigger loss payouts going and so forth. But around the science, it really, I think that there's a reticence in many cases. When I have conversations over lunch or whatever with my broker and underwriter friends, and I start bringing up science, there's kind of a polite nod, and then the conversation goes on to something else. So they just but I think we really got to focus on this stuff, and I think there's self-interest involved, right? Because especially, and I'm winking to you brokers on the line, the brokers should be talking to your cannabis clients about what is potentially a very large, unseen, uninsured or underinsured risk out there. So you should be talking about your with your carriers about, trying to get this done. Now carriers have a long experience with, environmental exposures, and they know how to insulate themselves, right? I mean, so we're talking about claims made forms and special retentions and special sublimits, defense within limits, policy triggers and exclusions, settlement provisions in the policy. Reinsurance companies have insulated themselves from COVID-related business interruption losses by special aggregation clauses, and that's certainly something that we could see used with cannabis potentially if we start seeing injury claims, coming around. So the insurance industry knows what to do with this. They can insulate themselves, but that leaves a big question. Okay, well, yeah, but what about the cannabis industry? They're going to be out there on their own, looking to fund potential liability that's years old. Because remember, injuries that happen where there's no clear correlation, you could potentially toll the statute of limitations. They could say that there's a tolling, until they understand, through a physician's opinion, for example, based on evolving science, that someone's lung injury, is related to vaping, for example. That is something. And again, I don't want to be all doom and gloom here, and and people have been talking about big tobacco style risks. And I think some of it's overblown, but I do think that we should at least acknowledge that it's a possibility, and it's great that we're having this discussion.
Yeah, speaking of a physician's opinion, Dr. Dahmer, as a practicing physician, what do you see as pros and cons of insurance coverage of medical cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, I want to defer that question as a physician, but I wanted to speak too that we've hinted before. In my career as a physician, I've never seen a medicine kind of brought to market by the patients themselves, and that's really the history of cannabis. And so, I'm not an insurance company. If I were to get buy-in from my constituents that are advocates, right? And not everyone is, but we're reaching, levels as high as statin use when you look at the number of Americans that have used cannabis, right? And so not too many of my patients get excited about their Zocor getting covered. A few, but I think we're going to see a lot more that are interested and excited about cannabis being covered and an option. Some of the, one of the biggest things that kind of brought me to the table as well, in addition to that LD50, which I talked that risk of death is virtually zero, but, really I see as a primary care physician an epidemic of polypharmacy. I mean, the rates are just skyrocketing, and not only is this bad for our patients, but the cost associated with that. And Bradford in 2016 did a fantastic study looking at Medicare Part D in 17 states over a 4-year period, and saw that if and when cannabis is allowed as an option, a legal option, 7 in 9 domains of pharmaceutical drug use fell, and to a tune of $165.2 million. And again, the last thing I do as a physician is say, drop all your meds for cannabis. That obviously is not the path to go, but we over and over see this with the patients that we serve, from the physicians that we work with, that so many realms of pharmaceutical use start to fall away. Cannabis is this platform medicine that we're going to see a reduction, in my opinion, in the future of that pharmaceutical cost. And I think it's very exciting that there are countries ahead of us, Canada, Australia, Germany, that already has coverage for medical cannabis. We saw, I think just this past year, a 34% increase in insurance reimbursables for medical cannabis in Germany. There's going to be some fantastic data coming out of there that we're all going to be looking at closely. How does that impact overall health? How does that impact, other pharmaceutical use? Exciting times. And again, Americans for Safe Access just looked at Minnesota. The number of chronic pain patients that have made it to the medical cannabis program that are enrolled in receiving medicine is less than 0.5% of the chronic pain patients. And so the potential here, if the data solidifies that this is a strong approach, the potential to offer a tool to help people and potentially reduce other pharmaceutical costs is huge. And I put on my pro hat here because I've faced the stigma for so long, but the cons are obviously there. And Ian just hinted at so many of them that kind of lie in waiting, that are very nerve-wracking, even for us as physicians. And, I think a big challenge will just be defining what's medical. I could foresee, a lot of people very upset. What do you mean mine's not covered? I use it, for a medical reason. And really, what is that delineation of medical versus adult, or what we call recreational? And then the other huge hurdle is going to be this tremendously fast evolution of the industry that we keep hinting at. And you can't keep up with the number of products. And unfortunately, we're supersizing THC, as we've done with tobacco and opioids and sugar, and fill in the blank that I've seen as a clinician. We have to be very careful with that, and that's where I think it could be seen as an opportunity. Let's define what medical is and give it the parameters that we know will support a healthy relationship with this plant, that will potentially improve quality of life and help our patients.
Wow. And time just flew by on this panel. We need 4 more of them to really continue this conversation. But appreciate all your time. In the last couple minutes, we just go around a little round robin. In 2 sentences, just summarize your thoughts on the future of this industry, and tell us a good way to reach you. Ian, why don't we start with you?
Remain very optimistic. I think there's bumps in the road ahead. Certainly. We'll see what happens whenever we get interstate commerce. I think that there's an assumption that once we solve Schedule 1, all is going to be hunky dory and roses and sunshine, and I think that that's probably very wrong. That there's going to be a lot of interstate issues that are going to come up, and that's going to affect the insurance industry as well around how they underwrite these risks. So.
And how can they reach you, Ian?
Oh, sorry.
How could they look Wilson Elser's website? How can?
Oh yeah, wilsonelser.com/cannabis.
Awesome, thank you, Andrew. Kicking it to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Paloma, and Ian and Stephen. This was great. So I would just say that I think it's really critical to continue to build the evidence base for the use of cannabis medicines more generally, and then specifically really drilling down into what's working. And I do think that while it is happening in a very different way than most pharmaceuticals, we are definitely making progress. And I think that's going to be critical. And it'll be interesting to see what happens on the federal side, because that could kind of change the dynamics quite a bit. And I can be reached at andrew@persana.com, HURSANA.
And wrapping us all up, Dr. Stephen Dahmer.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, what a pleasure, what a fun discussion, and just again, so timely, so important. Thank you for this opportunity. Amazing job, Paloma. And again, want to reinforce what Andrew states and applaud Andrew and the work that he's doing. Let's use data and make smart decisions. We've made mistakes in the past, and that usually is one of our most important pillars in making those decisions move forward. And I would say, let's also reframe cannabis rather than, oh man, another thing and all these scary as an opportunity. I really see this as a tremendous opportunity that should be backed by data. And I'll tell a 20-second story real quick. We had an insurance company approach us that was interested in their highest opioid user. And you guys have great data. I'm winking at the insurance people out there. Their highest opioid user to put through the program. I was so enthralled, so excited just to have this opportunity. And unfortunately fizzled out. And that's because there are so many barriers, but we need some of these pilots to start to explore, and those teams that are willing to look at the data and try to make sense of it and explore, is this something that truly can help people and save money? It could be a double win if we do it correctly and follow the data.
Well, thank you for that. And Ian, Andrew, and Dr. Dahmer, thank you all so much. Business Insurance, thank you for doing such an amazing conference again, and we'll see you next year.
Thank you.